The old dirt road leading to True Scary Farm was shrouded in mist, and the headlights of Derek's truck barely pierced through the thick fog. It was the farm's grand reopening after a decade of being abandoned, and Derek's group of friends thought it would be fun to visit. Urban legends swirled around the place, tales of vanishing workers, cursed harvests, and the family that had disappeared without a trace. But for Derek and his friends, it was all part of the thrill. The farm loomed ahead, its skeletal barn silhouetted against the moonlight. As the group stepped out of the truck, the air seemed colder, heavier. The laughter and banter they shared on the way there faded as they took in their surroundings. The dilapidated farmhouse leaned at an unnatural angle, and the fields were a tangle of lifeless corn husks, their stalks bending like twisted arms reaching for the sky. A rusted sign near the entrance bore the farm's name, its letters faded and streaked with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. "All right, let's split up," said Derek, trying to mask his own unease. "We'll cover more ground that way." No one argued, though an unspoken tension lingered in their exchanged glances. The group dispersed. Derek and his girlfriend, Lila, headed towards the barn, while their friends ventured into the fields and farmhouse. The barn door creaked as Derek pushed it open, revealing a cavernous space littered with rusting tools and broken machinery. Chains dangled from the rafters, swaying gently as if stirred by some unseen force. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and Lila gagged. "This place is disgusting," she whispered. As they ventured deeper, Derek's flashlight flickered and went out. "Great," he muttered, smacking it. Suddenly, a rhythmic creaking sound echoed from above. They froze. Slowly, Derek tilted his flashlight upward and gave it a hard tap. The beam sputtered to life, illuminating the source of the noise. A figure swinging from one of the chains, its head lolling unnaturally. Lila screamed, and the sound seemed to rattle the very walls. Derek grabbed her hand and bolted out of the barn. The others were already running toward them, pale and wide-eyed. "We saw something," gasped Jake, one of their friends. "In the fields. It was like a person, but not." He couldn't seem to explain further. "We need to leave," Lila insisted, tears streaming down her face. But as they turned toward the truck, a loud metallic screech filled the air, followed by the slamming of the barn door. Derek rushed back to the truck, only to find the tires slashed and the windows shattered. Panic set in. The group huddled together, their breath visible in the frigid air. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching over the brittle corn stalks. They turned toward the sound, but saw nothing. Another set of footsteps echoed from the opposite direction. Then another. They were surrounded. "Stay together," Derek said, though his voice betrayed his fear. The group backed away, inching toward the farmhouse, thinking it might offer some kind of refuge. But as they entered, the door slammed shut behind them, and the temperature dropped even further. The walls were covered in old photographs, each one showing a different family, smiling faces that seemed to twist and distort the longer they stared at them. Jake let out a strangled yell. "What's happening?" he shouted, clawing at his face. His skin seemed to writhe as though something was moving beneath it. He fell to the floor, convulsing. The others backed away in horror, but there was no time to process what was happening. Shadows began to crawl along the walls, taking on grotesque forms. One by one, the group was separated. The house became a maze of hallways that hadn't been there before, each one leading to more terror. Lila found herself in a room filled with mirrors, each reflecting a version of herself that was decayed or screaming in agony. Derek was drawn to the basement, where faint whispers called his name. By the time the sun began to rise, the farm was silent once more. The truck remained where it was, its interior now eerily clean, as if no one had ever been there. The farmhouse and barns stood as they always had, weathered and forgotten. Locals who drove past True Scary Farm in the following days claimed they heard faint laughter mixed with screams. None dared to investigate. Decades later, the legends of the farm would grow even darker, fueled by whispers of a group of friends who went there one night and never came back. The storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds swirling above the desolate stretch of Highway 13. Jenny was driving home after visiting her parents, the 2-hour trip made longer by the relentless rain. Her car's wipers barely managed to clear the windshield as she squinted through the gloom. Then, a sign appeared on the side of the road, barely visible in her headlights. Morris Hollow, 1 mile. She frowned. That name wasn't familiar. She had driven this route countless times, yet she had never noticed a turnoff for Morris Hollow. Her GPS didn't show it either, but when the next mile marker passed, the faint glow of a gas station flickered in the distance. The needle on her gas gauge hovered near empty, and she decided to stop. The station was ancient, its rusted sign swaying precariously in the wind. A single light buzzed overhead, casting an eerie yellow glow. Jenny parked under the awning as the light grabbed her wallet and stepped out. The rain was cold, and the air carried an odd metallic tang. As she approached the pump, she noticed the station attendant standing inside, watching her through the cracked glass. He was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken into his face. Jenny offered a polite wave, but he didn't respond. Unease prickled the back of her neck, but she brushed it off and focused on refueling. The pump clicked off after only a few dollars worth of gas. She frowned, squeezed the handle again, but no more came out. Sighing, she walked to the door of the station to ask for help. The attendant was gone. The interior of the station was even more unsettling than the outside. Dust covered the shelves, and the items looked decades old. Rusted cans of oil, faded candy wrappers, and empty soda bottles. A small television in the corner played static, the white noise filling the oppressive silence. "Hello?" Jenny called out. Her voice echoed unnaturally, as if the space were much larger than it appeared. No response. She turned back to the door but froze. The view outside had changed. The gas pumps were gone, replaced by an expanse of black nothingness. Her breathing quickened. She pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The glass was no longer transparent, now a glossy obsidian surface. Behind her, a faint noise started, barely audible at first, like a soft whisper. She spun around, her heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. Words she couldn't understand echoed from the shadows of the station. She backed away, her heel hitting a shelf, knocking over a can that rolled noisily across the floor. That's when she saw it, a figure, barely distinguishable in the flickering light, standing at the far end of the store. It was tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin pinpricks of light in the darkness. Jenny stumbled backward, her hand groping for something, anything, to defend herself. She grabbed a metal rod propped near the door and held it in front of her like a shield. The figure began to move, its limbs jerking as though it didn't fully understand how to use them. The whispering grew louder, overlapping until it was a cacophony of voices in her head. She screamed, swung the rod wildly, and ran for the back of the station. A door there led to a hallway that shouldn't have existed. It stretched endlessly, lined with more shelves that seemed to melt and reform as she passed them. The whispers followed, now accompanied by the sound of wet footsteps. She didn't dare look back. Finally, the hallway opened into a room. It was circular, the walls covered in mirrors. Jenny skidded to a stop, staring at her reflections. They didn't move with her. Each one stared directly at her, their mouths slowly curling into identical, sinister grins. She backed into the center of the room, her mind racing. Her phone was in her pocket. She pulled it out, but the screen was filled with static. The mirrors began to ripple, the glass shifting like liquid. One by one, her reflections stepped out of the frames. They moved toward her, their footsteps silent. She screamed as the first one grabbed her wrist, its touch ice cold. Another clutched her shoulder. Their grins widened impossibly, splitting their faces as they dragged her toward one of the mirrors. The glass rippled again, like water, and she felt herself being pulled into its surface. The last thing Jenny saw before darkness consumed her was her reflection, staring back from the other side, smiling a smile that wasn't hers. The next morning, a traveler on Highway 13 reported an abandoned car near the turnoff to Morris Hollow. The authorities found no sign of Jenny, but the gas station was there, decrepit and untouched, just as it had been for decades. Inside, on the dust-covered counter, sat Jenny's phone. The screen was cracked, but it played a video of her sitting behind the counter, staring at the camera with a grin that stretched far too wide. The sun was setting as Melanie drove through the winding back roads of rural Maine, her GPS struggling to keep a signal. She was on her way to her friend Brooke's new house, a place so remote that it didn't appear on most maps. Brooke had promised it was worth the trek, a historic mansion, untouched by time, surrounded by dense woods. Melanie had been skeptical about the isolation, but she couldn't resist the promise of a weekend escape. As twilight deepened, Melanie's car crested a hill, revealing the mansion in the distance. It was enormous, its towering gables and ivy-covered walls casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The driveway was lined with crumbling stone statues, their features weathered into grotesque smirks. Pulling up, she noticed Brooke's car parked out front, but no sign of her friend. The windows of the house glowed faintly, flickering like candlelight. Melanie grabbed her bag and headed to the front door, which creaked open before she could knock. "Brooke," she called out, stepping into the grand foyer. The air inside was heavy and damp, carrying a faint smell of mildew and something sweeter like rotting fruit. The decor was straight out of another century. Faded tapestries, a grand staircase with intricate woodwork, and an antique chandelier whose bulbs barely illuminated the space. A note lay on the hall table, written in Brooke's neat handwriting. "I'm in the basement. Come find me." Melanie frowned. Brooke hated basements. She hated anything dark or confined. Shrugging off the unease creeping up her spine, Melanie set her bag down and made her way toward a door under the staircase, which she assumed led to the basement. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying gently and casting unsettling shadows on the stone walls. "Brooke?" she called again, her voice echoing. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a vast, cavernous space. It didn't make sense. It was far too large to be under the house. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and strange symbols were etched into the surfaces. In the center of the room was an old wooden table, and on it sat a small box. The air seemed to hum around it, a low vibration that made Melanie's teeth ache. There was no sign of Brooke. Against her better judgment, Melanie approached the table. The box was simple but aged, the wood dark and splintered, with a strange metal clasp shaped like an eye. She felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, her hand hovering over the lid despite the voice in her head screaming to stop. The moment she touched it, the room went silent. The hum vanished, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the world had stopped. Slowly, Melanie lifted the lid. Inside was a key, ornate and blackened, as if scorched by fire. A whisper broke the silence. It wasn't her name, it wasn't even in a language she could understand, but it echoed in her mind, low and malevolent. She slammed the box shut and stumbled backward, knocking over a stool. The sound seemed to break whatever spell held the air still. The hum returned, louder this time, and the shadows on the walls began to move. Panic surged through her as she backed toward the stairs, clutching the railing to pull herself up. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly, the staircase now impossibly long. The whispers grew louder, layered over each other until they were a cacophony of madness. When she reached the top, she threw open the door and slammed it shut behind her, gasping for air. But the house was no longer the same. The grand foyer was gone, replaced by a long, narrow hallway that stretched into darkness. The flickering light was now dimmer, the walls cracked and oozing a black, tar-like substance. "Brooke!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. From the shadows ahead, something moved. It wasn't Brooke. The figure was tall and hunched, its limbs too long, its head tilting unnaturally as it stepped closer. The sound of its movements was wet, like flesh dragging across stone. Melanie turned and ran, the hallway twisting and shifting as she moved. Doors appeared on either side, slamming open and shut, revealing glimpses of horrors. Brooke's face, pale and lifeless, her eyes wide and staring. A room filled with writhing, shadowy figures. A mirror reflecting Melanie herself, bloodied and screaming. She didn't stop. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but the whispers were right behind her, and the creature's wet footsteps grew louder. Finally, a door appeared ahead, glowing faintly. She threw herself against it, tumbling outside into the cold night air. The mansion was gone. She was standing on the side of the road, her car parked a few feet away. Everything was silent except for the sound of her own ragged breathing. Shaking, she climbed into her car and sped away, not daring to look back. When she reached town, she went straight to the police. But when she mentioned the mansion, the officer's face darkened. "Morris House?" he asked. "That place burned down 30 years ago. No one's been there since." Melanie insisted, but when they drove back to the location, there was nothing there, just a charred foundation overgrown with weeds. In the middle of the ruins, though, was something that made her blood run cold. A small blackened box sitting on an old wooden table. The wind howled through the trees as Emma trudged up the gravel path, her flashlight cutting a thin beam through the suffocating darkness. She had heard the stories about Blackwood Trail, a winding hiking path deep in the forest that was infamous for the disappearances. Friends, colleagues, even her own mother had warned her not to go. But Emma was a skeptic, and besides, she loved a good scare. Tonight, under a moonless sky, she had decided to face the legend head-on. The trailhead was marked by an ancient wooden sign carved with the words, "Enter at your own risk." Beneath it, someone had scrawled in faded red paint, "It sees you." Emma scoffed and adjusted her backpack. Legends were just that. Legends. The first hour of the hike was uneventful, the path quiet, except for the crunch of leaves under her boots. The dense trees on either side seemed to close in, their skeletal branches reaching toward the trail like grasping hands. She felt the chill of the air grow more pronounced the deeper she went, and an unsettling silence had fallen. No insects chirped, no animals rustled in the underbrush. Halfway down the trail, Emma spotted something strange. A red scarf dangled from a low-hanging branch, fluttering slightly despite the still air. She frowned, shining her flashlight on it. The fabric was frayed, stained with dark spots that looked suspiciously like dried blood. She reached out to touch it, but a low, guttural sound stopped her hand midair. It was faint, like a distant growl, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the oppressive silence. She shook her head, laughing nervously at herself, and continued walking. The trail began to twist and turn, the gravel path growing narrower. Her flashlight flickered, and she cursed, smacking it against her palm. The light steadied, but the beam seemed weaker now, barely illuminating the path ahead. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of her light. It was tall and motionless, shrouded in shadows. Her heart raced as she called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Emma took a cautious step forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. As the beam inched closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, vanishing before her eyes. She blinked, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her. "Great," she muttered. "Now I'm scaring myself." But as she turned to keep walking, she felt it, a presence behind her. A faint breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping the trees. Nothing. The forest seemed alive now, the shadows shifting, the trees creaking as though they were whispering to one another. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The trail felt wrong now, the bends too sharp, the trees too close. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Suddenly, her foot caught on something, and she stumbled forward. When she looked down, her stomach twisted. It was a shoe, half buried in the dirt, its laces frayed and caked with mud. Next to it was a second shoe, smaller, like a child's. Her flashlight beam moved to the side, revealing more shoes. Dozens of them, scattered along the trail, some old and decayed, others looking disturbingly new. Panic surged through her. She turned to run, but the path behind her was gone. The trail had been replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees, their branches twisting together like claws. The forest was silent no longer. The guttural growl she had heard earlier was back, louder and closer. She spun in every direction, her flashlight revealing nothing but the endless trees. The growling morphed into whispers, overlapping and incomprehensible, surrounding her. Her flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging her into darkness. Emma froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. She fumbled for her phone, her trembling hands barely able to unlock the screen. The faint glow illuminated the path just enough for her to see them. Eyes, dozens of them, glinting in the shadows, watching her. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, chilling voice. It was low and distorted, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come," Emma screamed, dropping her phone as the eyes moved closer, their owners emerging from the shadows. They weren't human. Long, spindly limbs, impossibly thin bodies, and faces that were little more than hollowed-out voids. They moved with an unnatural, jerking motion, closing the distance faster than she could comprehend. She ran, blind and desperate, her lungs burning and her legs aching. She didn't know where she was going. There was no path, no sense of direction, only the primal instinct to get away. When she finally broke through the tree line, she collapsed onto a patch of cold grass. The stars were out and the wind was calm. She turned, expecting to see the forest behind her, but there was nothing. The trees were gone, replaced by an empty field. Emma lay there for hours, too terrified to move until the faint light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. A farmer driving by found her, disheveled and muttering incoherently. She tried to explain what happened, but no one believed her. The locals said there was no Blackwood Trail, just an old logging road that had been abandoned decades ago. But when Emma looked down at her arm, she saw it. A thin red thread tied around her wrist, frayed and blood-stained. The rain poured relentlessly as Natalie steered her car through the twisting mountain road, her wipers working overtime to combat the downpour. She wasn't supposed to be driving this late, but her friend Sarah had called her, frantic, begging her to come to her cabin. "I need you," Sarah had whispered over the phone, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." The cabin was perched at the edge of Pine Hollow, an isolated forest with a reputation for strange occurrences. People talked about the lights in the woods, the laughter that didn't belong to any living soul, and the whispers that carried on the wind. Natalie didn't believe in ghost stories, but Sarah's fear had been so palpable that she couldn't ignore it. When Natalie finally arrived, the cabin was dark. Her headlights illuminated the muddy driveway, and the building loomed ahead like a forgotten relic. The windows were lifeless, and no smoke curled from the chimney. She turned off the engine, grabbed her flashlight, and stepped out into the cold, wet night. "Sarah?" she called as she approached the cabin. The only response was the sound of the rain pelting the trees. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Natalie hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, carrying the faint smell of earth and decay. The living room was empty, though signs of a struggle were evident. A chair overturned, a shattered lamp lay, and muddy footprints leading toward the back door. Natalie's pulse quickened. "Sarah, are you here?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. Still nothing. She followed the footprints, her flashlight trembling in her hand. They led her to the back door, which was wide open, swinging on its hinges. Beyond it lay the forest, dense and unnervingly quiet. The rain had stopped, but the silence was worse. Not a single cricket chirped, and the wind had died completely. Reluctantly, she stepped into the woods, the beam of her flashlight piercing the darkness. The footprints continued, leading deeper into the trees. "Sarah?" Natalie called again, her voice sounding small in the oppressive stillness. A faint noise reached her ears, laughter, high-pitched and distant. It was faint, carried on the air like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It didn't sound like Sarah. It didn't sound human. She froze, her heart hammering. The laughter came again, closer this time. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the darkness seemed alive, shadows shifting in ways that defied logic. She whipped the light around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but clear. "Natalie." She turned sharply. The voice had come from her left, deeper into the woods. It sounded like Sarah, but something about it was wrong. The cadence was off, the pitch too perfect, like a recording. "Sarah?" she called, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" The laughter erupted again, this time surrounding her, bouncing off the trees. She spun in circles, the flashlight beam catching fleeting glimpses of movement, branches swaying, shadows darting. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as the voice called her name again, now from behind her. She turned to see a figure standing among the trees. It was Sarah, or at least, it looked like her. She was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips stretched into an unnatural smile. "Natalie," the figure said, its voice flat and hollow. "I'm so glad you came." Natalie stepped back, her flashlight shaking as she tried to process what she was seeing. "Sarah, are you okay?" she asked, though every instinct screamed for her to run. The figure tilted its head, the smile growing wider. "Come with me," it said, its voice layered as though two people were speaking at once. It took a step forward and Natalie stumbled back, tripping over a root. She hit the ground hard, her flashlight tumbling from her hand and rolling away. In the darkness, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Her hands scrabbled at the ground, searching for the flashlight. When she finally found it and turned it on, the beam illuminated Sarah's face. No, not Sarah. The features were wrong, subtly twisted, like a grotesque imitation. The smile was impossibly wide, stretching ear to ear, and the eyes were empty pits. Natalie screamed, scrambling to her feet and running blindly through the woods. The laughter followed her, growing louder, overlapping, filling her ears. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at her as she ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. When she finally broke through the tree line, she collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping for air. She turned back toward the woods, expecting to see the figure chasing her, but the forest was still. Too still. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Slamming the door shut, she turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Sarah, or whatever had been pretending to be Sarah, was standing at the edge of the forest, watching her. And as Natalie drove farther, the figure raised a hand and waved. The storm had been raging for hours, turning the narrow country road into a river of mud. Claire's car skidded on the slick surface, her headlights barely penetrating the sheets of rain. She cursed under her breath, gripping the wheel tightly. She had been on her way to her grandmother's house, but the GPS had stopped working miles ago, and now she was lost in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance, just off the road. A house. Relief washed over her as she pulled over, the tires sinking slightly into the muddy shoulder. Grabbing her jacket, she stepped out into the rain, shivering as the cold water soaked her within seconds. The house was old, its wooden facade warped and weathered. The light came from a single window on the second floor, casting a warm, yellow glow. Claire knocked on the door, her fist thudding against the damp wood. "Hello? Is anyone home?" she called. No response. She tried the handle, and the door creaked open. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said, stepping inside. "My car broke down, and I just need to use a phone." The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something sweet, almost cloying. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the walls were lined with dusty picture frames. Claire's footsteps echoed unnervingly as she moved through the foyer. "Hello?" she called again, her voice shaking. The house seemed empty, but the light upstairs suggested someone was there. She climbed the staircase, each step groaning under her weight. The second floor was darker, the only illumination coming from the door at the end of the hallway. As she approached, she heard it. A faint humming, soft and melodic like a lullaby. Her heart pounded as she pushed the door open. The room was sparsely furnished, with a small bed, a rocking chair, and a cracked mirror on the wall. Sitting in the chair was a woman, her back to Claire, swaying gently as she hummed. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to barge in, but I need help." The humming stopped. The woman's head tilted slightly as if she were listening. Claire took a cautious step closer. "Do you have a phone I could use? My car." The woman turned abruptly, and Claire's words died in her throat. The figure in the chair wasn't a woman at all. Its face was wrong, pale and featureless, with no eyes, no nose, only a wide, jagged mouth stretched into a grin. The thing stood, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Claire stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of a rug. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs. The figure stepped toward her, its grin widening impossibly. Claire scrambled to her feet and ran, her screams echoing through the empty house. She tore down the stairs, her only thought to get back to her car, but as she reached the front door, she stopped cold. The door was gone. The entryway she had come through was now a solid wall, the peeling wallpaper mocking her desperation. She turned, searching for another way out, but the house had changed. The furniture was gone, the walls bare and cracked. The windows were bricked over, and the air had grown colder, each breath visible as a puff of mist. A soft thudding sound came from behind her. She turned slowly, the flashlight beam trembling in her hands. The figure was there, standing at the foot of the stairs, its head cocked to one side. It raised a hand, long fingers curling in a beckoning gesture. Claire bolted, running blindly through the house, her screams bouncing off the walls. Every door she opened led to another hallway, another room, none of them leading outside. The walls seemed to shift as she moved, the house warping and twisting to trap her. Finally, she stumbled into a room she didn't recognize. It was small, with no furniture except for a single chair in the center. On the chair was a mirror, its surface cracked and foggy. The door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, but there was no handle, no way out. The room grew darker, the only light coming from the mirror. As she approached, her reflection began to shift, distorting into something unrecognizable. The face in the glass wasn't hers. It was the thing from the chair, its jagged mouth splitting into a wide grin. Claire screamed as the reflection reached out of the mirror, its hands grasping at her. She tried to pull away, but the glass seemed to ripple like water, dragging her closer. The last thing she saw was her own terrified face disappearing into the mirror, her scream swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, a passerby noticed her car abandoned on the side of the road. The police found no sign of Claire, only the faint sound of humming coming from the woods nearby. The clock struck midnight as Ethan and his three friends, Mia, Ryan, and Kayla, pushed open the rusted gates of Blackridge Cemetery. The iron groaned, the sound echoing through the silent graveyard. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and a dense fog rolled across the ground, clinging to their legs as they stepped inside. "This place is seriously creepy," Kayla whispered, clutching her flashlight. "That's the point," Ryan said with a grin, though his bravado seemed forced. "The legend says if you stay until dawn, you'll see her." Mia rolled her eyes. "The Blackridge bride? Come on, that's just a ghost story to keep kids out of here." Ethan wasn't so sure. The Blackridge bride was a tale everyone in their small town knew, a bride who was jilted at the altar and took her own life in the cemetery, forever doomed to wander in her wedding dress searching for her lost groom. They said she appeared to anyone foolish enough to stay in the graveyard past midnight, her veil covering a face twisted in rage. "Let's just set up," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. He pointed to an old oak tree near the center of the cemetery, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. They spread out blankets and snacks, pretending it was just another camping trip. Ryan cracked jokes, Mia rolled her eyes, and Kayla nervously laughed, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The fog grew thicker as the hours passed, and the temperature dropped sharply. The others chatted, but Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, the shadows between the gravestones seeming to shift when he wasn't looking. At 2 a.m., the first sign came. A faint, distant sobbing floated through the air, carried on the wind. Everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Kayla whispered, her voice trembling. "It's probably the wind," Mia said, though her face had gone pale. The sobbing grew louder, clearer. It was the sound of a woman crying, her voice broken and despairing. Ethan shone his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam was swallowed by the fog. "Let's go check it out," Ryan said, standing and grabbing his own flashlight. He tried to sound brave, but his hands were shaking. "No way," Kayla said. "This is where we leave. Now." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "She's right, let's just go." But when they turned toward the gates, they weren't there anymore. The cemetery stretched endlessly in every direction, the gravestones distorted by the fog. "That's impossible," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We came in through that gate. It was right there." The sobbing stopped. The silence was deafening. Then the fog parted. She stood there just a few feet away. A bride, her white dress tattered and stained, her veil shrouding her face. She didn't move, didn't speak. She only stood, her head tilting slightly as if watching them. Ryan stepped forward, his flashlight trained on her. Who are you?" he stammered. The bride lifted a hand, her finger pointing directly at Ethan. A chill ran down his spine. "Run," Kayla whispered. The bride's hand dropped and she began to move. Not walking, gliding, her feet never touching the ground. The veil fluttered slightly, revealing a glimpse of what lay beneath. A gaping, black maw where her face should have been. The group scattered, sprinting in different directions through the maze of gravestones. Ethan's heart pounded as he ran, the fog closing in around him. He could hear the others shouting, their voices growing fainter. He tripped over a broken headstone and fell hard, the flashlight tumbling from his hand. Scrambling to his feet, he turned to see her standing just a few feet away, closer than she should have been. Her veil was gone now. Her face, or what remained of it, was a grotesque mask of rotted flesh and hollowed-out eyes, her mouth twisted into a hideous grin. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice echoing inside his skull. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs refusing to obey him. She reached for him, her icy fingers brushing his cheek, and he screamed. The next thing he knew, it was morning. He was lying on the damp grass, the sun peeking over the horizon. The cemetery was quiet, the fog gone. Ethan sat up, his heart racing. Mia and Kayla were sitting nearby, their faces pale and tear-streaked. "Ryan's gone," Mia said, her voice hollow. "We looked everywhere. He's just gone." Ethan stared at the ground, his mind racing. On the grass beside him was something that hadn't been there before, a single wilted white rose stained with blood. From the edge of the cemetery, a faint sobbing began again, carrying on the morning breeze. The old amusement park loomed ahead, its rusted gates twisted and bent, the faded sign above barely legible in the moonlight. "Wonderland Acres," it read, though most of the letters had fallen away. The place had been abandoned for decades, left to decay after the infamous accident. Stories of what happened varied. Some said a ride malfunctioned, others claimed something darker, something supernatural. Olivia, Jake, and Ben had heard all the stories. They were thrill seekers, urban explorers looking for their next big scare, and tonight, the park was their target. The trio slipped through the broken gates, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the darkness. The air was heavy with the scent of wet metal and rotting wood. The carousel stood eerily still in the center of the park, its paint peeling and horses frozen mid-leap. Beyond it, the Ferris wheel loomed, its skeletal frame creaking softly in the wind. "This is insane," Olivia muttered, pulling her jacket tighter against the chill. "That's why we're here," Jake said with a grin, his camera already rolling. "This place is legendary." Ben lagged behind, his eyes darting to every shadow. "Let's just get some footage and go," he said. "I don't like this." "Relax," Jake said. "It's just an old park." They ventured deeper past the corroded ticket booths and crumbling snack stands. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water or the rustle of leaves. Then they heard it. Faint music, distant but unmistakable. The haunting melody of a calliope. Olivia froze. "Do you hear that?" Jake nodded, his excitement growing. "This is it. People say the music plays when she's near." "Who's she?" Ben asked, though he already knew the answer. "Annabelle," Jake said, lowering his voice as if the name itself was dangerous. "The park's owner's daughter. She died here on the carousel. They say her spirit still lingers." The music grew louder, echoing through the empty park. It seemed to be coming from the carousel. The trio exchanged uneasy glances before heading toward it. The carousel was alive. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. The painted horses moved, their heads bobbing slowly, their glassy eyes glinting in the light. The Calliope's tune was warped, the notes bending unnaturally. "I thought there was no power here," Olivia whispered. "There isn't," Ben said, his voice trembling. Jake raised his camera, focusing on the carousel. "This is incredible," he said. "It's like it's alive." Suddenly, the music stopped. The silence was deafening. A cold wind swept through the park, and with it came the sound of laughter, soft, childlike, and chilling. The trio turned as one, their flashlights catching movement at the edge of the shadows. A little girl stood there, had her dress tattered and white, her hair hanging limp around her pale face. She held a stuffed rabbit in one hand, its button eyes glinting in the light. Her head tilted slightly, and a slow smile spread across her face. "Hello," she said, her voice sweet and hollow. Olivia took a step back, her flashlight trembling. "Who are you?" The girl didn't answer. She just turned and began walking toward the Ferris wheel, the stuffed rabbit dragging behind her. The trio stood frozen until Jake whispered, "Follow her." "Are you insane?" Ben hissed. "We need to leave. Now." But Jake was already moving, his camera trained on the girl. Olivia hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity, before following him. Ben cursed under his breath and reluctantly brought up the rear. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its rusted gondolas swaying gently. The girl stopped at the base, turning to face them. Her eyes were dark pits now, empty and endless. "Do you want to ride?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. "No," Ben said, backing away. "No, we're leaving." Jake ignored him, stepping closer. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his bravado. The girl's smile widened and the Ferris wheel groaned to life. The gondolas creaked as they began to spin, the wheel turning faster than it should have been able to. "You'll stay," the girl whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. The wind picked up, howling through the park, and the lights of the Ferris wheel flared bright, bathing the trio in an eerie glow. The laughter returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing as if dozens of unseen children surrounded them. Ben turned to run, but the shadows came alive, twisting and stretching, blocking his path. He screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony. Olivia grabbed Jake's arm, trying to pull him back, but the girl was moving toward them now, her face shifting, warping into something inhuman. "Leave us," she hissed, her voice a chorus of whispers. The shadows surged forward and everything went dark. When Olivia woke, the sun was rising, casting golden light over the abandoned park. She was lying on the cold ground near the gates, her flashlight and camera gone. Ben was beside her, unconscious but breathing. Jake was nowhere to be seen. The carousel was silent and still, the Ferris wheel a lifeless skeleton against the dawn. But as Olivia stood, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Hanging from the highest gondola of the Ferris wheel was Jake's camera, swaying gently in the breeze, and beneath the lens, scrawled in red across the ground, was a single word: "Stay." The rain poured relentlessly as Aaron sped down the lonely country road, his windshield wipers barely keeping up. He'd taken this shortcut a dozen times before, but tonight it felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows longer. He almost didn't see the figure standing in the middle of the road. Slamming on the brakes, Aaron skidded to a stop, his heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It was a woman, drenched by the rain, her long black hair plastered to her face. She wore a pale dress that clung to her thin frame, and her head was bowed. Aaron rolled down his window slightly, the cold rain spraying his face. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't answer, just stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Against his better judgment, Aaron opened the car door. "Do you need a ride?" The woman nodded slowly and walked toward the passenger side. As she climbed in, Aaron noticed her bare feet caked in mud. She didn't say a word, just folded her hands neatly in her lap and stared straight ahead. Aaron cleared his throat as he started driving again. "Where are you headed?" She whispered something, but it was too faint to hear. "What was that?" he asked, glancing at her. Her head turned sharply to face him, her lips barely moving. "Home." "Okay, where's home?" he asked, uneasy. She pointed down the road. "Just keep going." The tension in the car was suffocating. Aaron tried to make conversation, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she hummed softly, a tune that sounded vaguely familiar but off somehow, discordant, like a lullaby gone wrong. After several miles, she spoke again, her voice low and hollow. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Aaron laughed nervously. "Not really." "Why?" The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You should." Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, emitting bursts of static. Aaron fiddled with the knob, but the static grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers. He could have sworn he heard his name. Then the car's headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Aaron slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The woman didn't react. She just stared ahead, unbothered by the blackness. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, hitting the dashboard. The lights flickered back on, and Aaron gasped. They were no longer on the road. The car was surrounded by dense trees, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like clawing hands. Mist curled around the ground, thick and unnatural. "I didn't turn off the road," Aaron said, his voice trembling. "How did we?" "You're close now," the woman said, her tone eerily calm. "Just a little farther." Aaron's instincts screamed at him to get out of the car and run, but he was paralyzed by fear. The woman's gaze was fixed on the windshield, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. "Turn here," she said suddenly, pointing to a gap in the trees. Aaron didn't want to obey, but his hands moved on their own, twisting the wheel. The car bumped along a dirt path that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The trees grew denser, the mist thicker. The air felt heavy, pressing against his chest. The path ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated house, its windows dark and empty. The roof sagged and the walls were covered in ivy and moss. Aaron swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel. "This is it," the woman said, her voice almost a sigh. She opened the door and stepped out, her bare feet sinking into the mud. I should go," Aaron stammered, but she turned to him, her expression softening into something almost sad. "You can't leave yet," she said. "You brought me here." Before Aaron could respond, she walked toward the house, disappearing inside. Against every rational thought, he found himself following her, his feet moving as if compelled. The interior of the house was worse than he'd imagined. The walls were blackened by age and soot, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The air smelled of rot and mildew. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. A faint noise came from upstairs, a soft, rhythmic creaking like a rocking chair. Aaron climbed the stairs slowly, each step groaning beneath him. The noise grew louder, accompanied by the same off-kilter humming he'd heard earlier. At the top of the stairs was a door, slightly ajar. The humming stopped as he reached for the handle. Pushing it open, he found himself in a small bedroom. The woman sat in a rocking chair by the window, cradling something in her arms. She turned to him, her face now gaunt and hollow, her eyes sunken and black. The thing in her arms wasn't a baby. It was a bundle of rags soaked with dark, sticky blood. "Thank you for bringing me home," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. Aaron stumbled back, his breath hitching. The woman stood, the room growing colder as she approached, her features twisted, her smile stretching impossibly wide. "You can stay," she said, her voice a rasp. "You belong here now." Aaron turned and ran, barreling down the stairs and out of the house. The mist was thicker, the trees closing in as he sprinted back to his car. He jumped inside, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the dirt path, the house shrinking in his rearview mirror. The road returned as suddenly as it had vanished, and Aaron didn't stop driving until he was miles away. When he finally pulled over to catch his breath, he noticed something on the passenger seat. A single white veil, damp and torn, rested there, a faint smell of decay clinging to it. And from the depths of the forest somewhere far behind him, he swore he could hear humming.